also smells very nice as well. This is a black plum and rhubarb by Mowgli and Moon. Very nice. So at the beginning we've got this photograph. Now this is the fire monument in London. You can see it just there. We are going to go straight to chapter 1. The Great Fire of London in 1666. Chapter 1. London in the year 1666. Samuel Pepys, who was living at the time at the Navy Office in Seething Lane near the Tower of London, tells readers of his immortal diary that on Saturday, the 1st of September 1666, certain of his maidservants sat up late getting things ready against the feast on the Lord's Day. At 3 in the morning, Jane awakened the household to inform them of a fire seen in the city. So I rose, he writes, and slipped on my nightgown, and went to her window, and thought it to be at the backside of Mark Lane at the farthest, but being unused to such fires as followed, I thought it far enough off, and so went to bed again and to sleep. The great fire begun in Pudding Lane by London Bridge had then less than 2 hours' growth. It seemed nothing. Could Pepys have known that no man would ever again see London as it was at that hour before dawn? Doubtless he would have stayed longer, but he was little concerned by the spectacle of fire with which the populace were unhappily familiar. From the upper window the city had spread out before him, a city of narrow streets and timber-framed houses, massed closely together, losing all separate identity in the mystery of the deep shadows, and against the heavens a silhouette formed of innumerable roof gables, carried upward at 100 points by church spires and towers. The London that perished in the Great Fire of 1666 was not the London of Charles II, but a city much older, with medievalism born upon its face. The distinction is often forgotten. Historical events hurry by, and never in such haste as in the first half of the 17th century. 50 years only had passed since Shakespeare died, the 23rd of April, 1616. In the plan of its streets and the elevation of by far the greater number of its buildings, the city of London survived exactly as Shakespeare had known it. Much had been added west. The unceasing creep of the town westward, which the fire was destined greatly to accelerate, had started long before that portentous event. Shakespeare's familiar Bankside was altered in character, since its theatres had ceased to attract play-loving citizens across the river. But the old city within the wall, amidst which the fire chiefly raged, that was the same, and in the liberties the buildings destroyed were mostly standing in the poet's own day. Shakespeare's London disappeared in the fire, disappeared wholly, save for a small area left immune about the eastern and northern wall, which lies like Crosby Hall in Bishopsgate, the Norman Tower guarding the river entrance, and Barking Church nearby, St. Olaf, Hart Street, St. Bartholomew the Great, Smithfield, and a few others beyond the limits reached by the flames, succeeding chapters of the London of 1666. From any tall building, such as the Tower of Gresham's Royal Exchange, an observer might have followed with his eye the complete circuit of the wall. London was still a walled city, to be entered from the Liberties only, the gates. Parts of the medieval wall may be seen above ground today, a bastion being preserved in the churchyard of St. Giles Cripplegate, and there is an open length opposite St. Alphege, London Wall, but the wall in 1666 was high and solid, and in most of its 2 miles length was an upstanding feature, higher than these remains suggest. In one surviving portion near the tower, built into Barber's bonded warehouse, the wall is complete from foundation to rampart and bulwark, rising to a height of 35 feet. Could one again walk the streets so encompassed, much would be seen to remind one of Elizabeth and Henry VIII, much too of Henry VI, and the great era of church building and restoration in the 15th century, but nothing of Charles II, whose return to the throne had been too recent for his age to stamp its individuality upon the ancient city. The Commonwealth had added nothing of permanence to London. The square brick tower of All Hallows Barking, by no means a bad example of this tasteless age, alone comes to mind. Nor had the reign of Charles I, shadowed at the outset by plague and marked by broken fortunes and civil strife, lent encouragement to civic development. Of the period of James I, a good deal was standing in the liberties of old time, the suburbs of London, and so called in 1,000 documents. But within the wall, the newest buildings were chiefly Elizabethan, and a great part of the city dated back to times more remote. The streets followed the lines laid down centuries before, and were as tortuous and narrow as you may find them today in any continental town where medievalism lingers. The Restoration enlarged a cleavage already begun in London's life. Royalists who returned with the king no longer came to dwell in the city, finding their father's houses diverted to other uses or unfitted for their reception. They settled by choice in more pleasant and open places nearer the court, about Lincoln's Inn Fields, where Inigo Jones in the previous reign had begun a great scheme of building, or farther west at Covent Garden, a quarter growing in favour with the fashionable mode. Henrietta Street bears the name of Charles I's consort. Some sought sites as far distant as Pall Mall, St. James's and Soho Fields. The courtiers affected to despise the cits, and the merchants, still Puritan at heart for a large part, whose interests were narrowly confined to the state of the markets and the safety of their own souls, went about their affairs little concerned with the frivolities and licentiousness of Whitehall. They were less troubled with the unrighteousness of the age than were their divines. Greater London in 1666 loosely covered perhaps twice as much ground as at the time of James I's accession, but it had spread west. Within the wall it remained unaffected. By changing times and modes, an speeches, not always with approval of the sermon, admired Betterton at the Salisbury Court Theatre, Fleet Street, above all actors. His coach, passing through the shambles, knocked 2 pieces of meat into the dirt, and Pepys thought himself fortunate to escape from the quarrelsome butchers at the cost of a shilling. There you realise the crush in Newgate Market. From the boat stairs by the bridge he took oars to Westminster on business or to Vauxhall for his amusement. All this is living London, but there is no trace that the stage scene interested him. Had it done so, we should have had a full view of the city destroyed in the flames. London's restless money-making life was grafted with some incongruity upon a city that was itself the result of the growth of centuries. On every hand were reminders in solid masonry of other times and influences. It was to William, Bishop in the first place, and to Godfrey, Portreeve, only in the second place, that William the Conqueror addressed his charter to London, a slip of parchment bearing but 66 words that is now a precious possession of Guildhall. Medieval London enjoyed a highly organised guild life. Its merchants were its governors, and managed its affairs free from interference by any overlord, save the king. But London's ascendancy as the commercial capital of the kingdom was built up in what was yet an ecclesiastical city, possessing an altogether disproportionate number of religious foundations. The great wealth was always that of the church, and it was evidenced in vast buildings. The majesty of which is suggested in the splendid fragment of the Augustinian monastery that we know as St. Bartholomew the Great, Smithfield, the Carthusian House, the Charter House, and the nave of Austin Friars Church, which today serves the Dutch Protestant colony in London for worship. The guilds themselves, standing stronger by the destruction of this rival power, were able to acquire magnificent houses in not a few instances from the spoils of the church. In every principal street were to be seen religious buildings serving a lay use. It required 2 catastrophic blows, the last of which was the Great Fire, to transform London into the purely commercial city that we know. The suppression of monasticism by Henry VIII had done much. The great Dominican priory at Blackfriars, whose arrogant magnificence is bitterly recalled in Piers Plowman's verse, the windows full of gay glittering glass glowing as the sun, was brought to the ground, as was the Carmelite priory at Whitefriars, the little baby nestling within the city wall, and much else. Thomas had stored a part of the great accumulation of books that perished in the fire of London. Large parts of the Carthusian monastery, some of great age, survive today. The refectory of Austin Friars served the Pinners Company as their hall. The chapel of Elsing Spittal became the parish church of St. Alphege, London Wall. The church built by the Knights Templars in the 12th and 13th centuries happily stands unharmed, safe, kept by the lawyers. The great fortress of the Tower guarded the river approach, but this and St. Paul's apart, London's public buildings had small distinction. London was not and has never been a magnificent city. Indeed, the poverty of its buildings formed the subject of slighting comment by many travellers accustomed to the artistic splendours of Toledo, of Venice, of Florence and Rome. The ancient Guildhall, the seat of civic government, was hemmed about with houses and hidden from sight, with no approach until Sir Christopher Wren, after the Great Fire, cut out King Street to open it to Cheapside. Access before that time was restricted to Lawrence Lane and Ironmonger Lane, passages so mean and narrow that in neither could two vehicles pass. Leadenhall enjoyed a better site, as might be expected, for there had stood a Roman building, believed by Sir Lawrence Gall to have been the Forum, stones of which still lie in the soil beneath the market. The Royal Exchange, which Queen Elizabeth, in compliment to the donor, Sir Thomas Gresham, had so named in person, was a worthy ornament of the city. Blackwell Hall, the city's cloth market, and the Custom House, dating from Elizabeth's reign, are but little known from the writings of contemporaries, who probably found little in them worthy of record. Large mansions of noblemen, replacing the ecclesiastics, remained along the Strand, extending west with the river frontage to their gardens. There were, besides, considerable numbers to be found within the city, built by nobles or wealthy merchant adventurers, but Aldersgate Street, where Petra House, Thanet House, Lauderdale House, and others were situated, almost alone remained a place of city residence of the old noble families. Many large mansions, after years of neglect, had been divided into tenements, and thus helped to house London's population. But for others, both lay and religious, a kindlier fate had been reserved when they passed into the possession of the livery companies. This fact, in its bearing upon London at the time of the fire, has never received the prominence it merits, for amid much else that was drab, they played no small part in giving to the city that aspect of picturesque antiquity which thereafter was lost. Some had become corporate property by gift of wealthy members of the companies benefited. Such was Painter Stainer's Hall in Trinity Lane, Queen Hithe, which originally was the residence of Sir John Brown, Sergeant Painter to King Henry VIII. Salter's Hall had been the town mansion of the Earl of Oxford. The larger halls had been acquired by purchase, mostly after confiscation by the Crown. Draper's Hall in Throckmorton Street, its large garden and the last bowling green maintained in the city, was the house of Thomas Cromwell, Earl of Essex, which had fallen to the Crown upon his attainder and execution on Tower Hill. The Mercers' Company took for their hall the property of the religious college of St. Thomas of Acon, amongst them being the most ancient buildings in the city, and these were destroyed by the fire. Actually, only 3 companies' halls had the water frontage, but a majority lay near the Thames side or else were clustered about Guildhall. The picturesqueness of the old city, which the flames devastated, consuming 13,200 houses, must not dull our sense to the fact that much of it was mean and squalid. Its tortuous ways, dark and evil-smelling, and constant obstructions to the slow-moving traffic, provoked the satire of Sir William Davenant a few years before the fire. "Sure," says he, "your ancestors contrived your narrow streets in the days of wheelbarrows, before those greater engines, carts, were invented. The stranger in London, in haste to be gone, found it unsafe to use the new public hackney coaches, till the quarrel be decided whether 6 of your nobles, sitting together, shall stop and give way to as many barrels of beer." London had always been crowded. Restoration London was densely overcrowded, even after the plague had reduced the numbers. The wars being ended and the armies disbanded, old soldiers came to the metropolis to set up trades, their families with them. With the monarchy again firmly established, a large train of people followed the return of the court, attending it to obtain rewards for services, preferments, and the like. There was a new era of reckless extravagance, unknown in the dour days of the Commonwealth. Luxury and fashion again ran riot, and to minister to the wants of the time, tradesmen in hundreds came to settle in business and take their profits out of the money now freely circulating. The Royal Exchange shops had become the city's bazaar for rare goods brought from every quarter of the world. They were never before so busy. Defoe, who was 6